You are listening to a White Phosphorus Pictures podcast.
Broadcasting under the night sky from the edge of an undisclosed jungle on the Gulf of Mexico, I'm Christopher Garetano, your voice in the night. For the next hour, allow me to be your guide into the bizarre unknown, the fantastic macabre, and together we'll journey to that borderland between fiction and reality, a place beyond all rational explanation. We are now off to the witch.
Sunday, the Ridgely Theater in Fort Worth had the biggest day in its entire history. It sold more than The Godfather, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Superman, and Love Story. But the biggest surprise to theater employees is the number of parents bringing young children to see Alien. Did you know that this was an R-rated movie when you brought him?
Yes, we did.
Are you sorry you brought him?
Yes, I am.
Are you glad you saw it?
Yeah.
Are you sorry, sir, that you brought your son along to see Alien?
No, ma'am, I think you should have seen it. It's something that he needs to know, that things like that could happen in life. That could be a true story, based on, science. We never know what's going on the outside of the world.
Did the movie scare you at all?
Yes, ma'am, it did.
We take him to see a lot of horror pictures and things like that, because we like horror movies.
That was from a local Texas news station in 1979, when a reporter interviewed moviegoers of all ages on their way out of what was at that time one of the most shocking, thrilling, and uniquely inventive motion pictures in movie history, Alien. Its execution was entirely original for its day, and those who experienced it back then were in awe. The 1970s and 1980s were the pinnacle of imagination and movie magic. Tonight, we celebrate that magic with our guest, whose entire life orbits with complete adoration around the wonders of cinema and all its history. I'll return after this commercial break.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
You are listening to the Off to the Witch podcast, where we explore that bizarre borderline between fiction and reality and all subjects arcane. Journey over to my YouTube channel and subscribe now at youtube.com/@offtothewitch for a variety of extras and special features, including the Off to the Witch mini docs with further insights on many of the latest episodes, as well as previews and behind the scenes of my forthcoming investigative series, Off to the Witch Presents, as well as the anniversary edition of my motion picture documentary, Montauk Chronicles. And follow us on social media. All links are available at linktree.com/Garetano7, GARETANO7, and stay tuned for more Off to the Witch.
It all began in this little shop.
Ow! Damn roses!
Where, strange as it seems, something extraordinary happened.
I'm afraid it isn't feeling very well today.
No, it's not bizarre.
What kind of a weirdo plot does that, Seymour?
Little Shop of Horrors, a story about a boy.
I've given you sunlight, I've given you rain. Looks like you're not happy, unless I open a vein.
Where did you get such a weird plan?
A girl.
You don't make a nice voice when you live on Skid Row, Mr. Mushnick. Seymour, this is my Dave, my boyfriend.
A florist.
I'm telling you, Audrey, he's not a good, clean kind of boy.
He's a professional.
You'll be a 10. You have a talent for causing things. Hey, son, be a 10. People will pay you to be in pain.
I've been saving all month for this. I think I need a root canal. I'm sure I need a long, slow root canal.
Feed me Seymour.
And a plant.
Feed
me all night long.
How am I supposed to keep on feeding you?
Whoa! Catch me now! I'm just a mean green mother from outer space, and I'm playing. I'm just a mean green mother from outer space, and it looks like you've been had.
Yes! Rick Moranis.
Man's a total disgrace to the dental profession.
Ellen Greene.
Excuse me.
Excuse me, what?
That's better.
Vincent Gardenia, with special guest appearances by Steve Martin, John Candy, and Bill Murray.
It's your professionalism that I respect.
Little Shop of Horrors.
Welcome back to Off to the Witch. I'm your host, Christopher Garitano, and tonight's guest, Justin Humphreys, is an author and film historian who shares our love for the greatest science fiction, horror, and adventure films that informed our youth and helped shape our lives and imagination. I encourage you to read his book about the great George Powell, who produced the 1953 adaptation of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. Tonight is simply a discussion of what we love about movies and our optimism for the future of a glorious art form that's still very much in its infancy. So here's my interview with Justin Humphreys.
I was born in Virginia. I was raised there. I spent my earliest memories are on farms. We lived on farms before. This was when I was up to and including about when I was in preschool. And I don't remember much of going to the movies then. I know I saw a few, but I grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia, and I don't know the chronology about when I saw these films, but I know that some of the biggest, the movies that had the biggest influence on me that I saw in the theater were probably Fantasia, Disney's Fantasia. I remember I went into it with no knowledge of it whatsoever, except that it was a Disney cartoon and it was basically, animation set to music. Maybe not even that much. But I remember the Night on Bald Mountain sequence absolutely floored me. I mean, I still think it's one of the greatest pieces of American filmmaking there is. I mean, and anybody who badmouths Disney should just look at that and weep.
Take me there, because that must have been such an incredible moment for a child. Can you, and it's hard sometimes for people who were born in the last 2 decades to really understand how magnificent it was to be at a theater in that time period when you were a kid. If somehow you can take us to that atmosphere, and then what was on the screen? Can you describe the scene?
I remember how I loved horror by that time. I loved all the tropes, graveyards and ghosts and flying creatures and all sorts of stuff like that. And I had never seen any animated film like that, as let alone on the small screen, let alone on the big screen. And of course, the music in it is so volcanically powerful, and visually, it's so powerful. Um, I was just overwhelmed. And I remember when we went home, it turned out my mom had Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain on vinyl, so I immediately was playing it. I was so delighted we had it. Neither of my parents were much for record collecting. That was a big one. I remember seeing Godzilla. It was reissued as Godzilla on Monster Island, but it was original, I think, Godzilla versus Gigan. And I saw it in a reissue, and I just remember loving it. I just remember absolutely loving it. I remember the alien shadows, the humanoid aliens that cast shadows that are like cockroaches, and I just remember being absolutely loving it. But the big one, the movie that absolutely made me fall head over heels in love with movies, was Jim Henson's Labyrinth. I vividly remember first seeing the trailer and that image of Jennifer Connelly in the ball gown smashing that glass wall with the chair. I had no idea what to expect from the movie, and when I finally saw it, I was just in love, absolutely in love. It was the one time I met Brian Henson, I told him, I said that seeing Labyrinth as a kid was one of the great movie going experiences of my life, and it was. And I just saw it not they reissued it not long ago, and I saw it in the theater, and it holds up really well, but there are certain effects in that movie, certain shots, certain scenes that are just mind blowing. The part where Jennifer Connelly's on the kind of parapet and Bowie's walking underneath her, and then he flips upward, and they have Bowie's double on a rig on his leg that will physically flip him up. And I get chills every time I see that effect. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. It's like it's great, great magic because you can't figure out how it's done. It's really, really extraordinary.
And so it was not unlike the way magicians would create illusions, except this was for motion pictures.
Yeah, and I remember I was reading something the other day where Francis Ford Coppola was talking about how a lot of filmmaking came from magic, like with Méliès, um, and it is actually incorporating magic into the films. And when Coppola was doing Bram Stoker's Dracula, one of the books that they were using for reference on the effects for it was an old book of magic tricks. I think it was like a Victorian or turn of the century book of magic tricks. So there is a lot of that, and but Labyrinth absolutely astounded me. Just astounded me. I realized just how you could create a completely different, complex, endlessly interesting world of unfettered imagination on the screen, and that was kind of a gateway drug for me.
And what is it that was available to movie makers, let's say up until the end of the 1980s, that might not be available now? Because all the technology in the world is in the hands of anyone that wants it. However, it does not make a better movie maker. The greatest movies were made virtually with zero of the technology that we have today.
Yeah, yeah. Because I think the economy and limitations can be an artistic virtue. When someone is forced to work with relatively minimal means, it can foster creativity. I think in the case of Henson, he had gotten so successful with the Muppets and so forth with the Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, he was able to do these big, intricate, expensive, risky movies. And I think now there's that term they use, risk averse, which I hate. It's a sort of polite way of saying timid. And the they were, I don't know. I think people are more scared of taking risks now. I don't know if audiences are as sophisticated in a lot of ways. I think in some ways they're more jaded, but they're not necessarily more sophisticated. And I don't know if I think as filmmaking technology has become more widely available, now that you can do a halfway decent looking movie on your phone, it doesn't carry the same weight that it did when you had to work with like 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter or whatever to get a decent image. Um, because they're so much more expensive and you have to put so much more thought into what you're filming to make sure you get something good, you know? It's less disposable, much less disposable.
Is it possible? And I definitely want to talk about more movies from that era and even before that inspired those filmmakers. But is it possible, or do you believe it's possible, with what we have, and that there might be another motion picture revolution up ahead for people outside of any studio or network system that now have all of these tools in their hands and might do something very creative that's not too dissimilar from the movies that had that magic when you were a kid?
Oh yeah, no, it could happen. It could completely happen. I haven't I don't feel hopeless about it at all. I think what I'll preface that by saying what astonishes me about a lot of these super big successful filmmakers now is, um, I'll give for an example, Steven Spielberg. Spielberg is worth more money than God if God needed money. I mean, the guy can write his own check. He can do whatever he wants. But what does he do? He does a lame remake of West Side Story, and he does The Fablemans, which nobody wants to see. I mean, neither of them makes any money. But the thing is, like, they're both playing it pretty safe. These are not risky movies. These are not experimental movies. And I always thought that part of the point of achieving big success is to take risks, you know. Um, but I think a lot of people play it too safely. You know, they can do whatever they want with a movie, especially now with, as you say, the materials of production being so much cheaper and easier to work with and so forth. But they play it safe. They go for something really commercial. They go for something that everybody's seen before. And and I'm not saying people should go out and do something, you know, incomprehensible. I'm just saying to do something really interesting and risky, you know, or something more personal, something very personal. Especially, I mean, look, if your expenditure on making a movie is very limited, if it's not going to make or break you, why not do something different? Why not do something that your heart is completely in, rather than something you think, oh well, this is safe. You know, this is a safe bet. Um, Hitchcock used to do those. He would do the movies that would make a ton of money, and he called them run for cover movies. And then he would, you know, make a ton of money on them, on these very safe commercial movies, and then he would go do something very personal. And but uh, but I think there the movies are a young medium. This is a very young medium. Um, this isn't even what are we going back now? 100 and a little over 125 years, something like that. That's not long. I mean, I think the movies are just getting started. I think what we need is perhaps a better system, or, you know, encouraging audiences to ask for more, you know.
Could it
Um,
could it be, let's say, because I see it forthcoming for sure, venue could inspire an entire new generation of very creative artists. For instance, right now there's a venue in the virtual world, and I want to get your take on this because you and I, if every Friday night we wanted to gather a group of people, all from different parts of the world, sit in a Ziegfeld-sized theater, and we could have a private screening of any movie we want, and we will feel like we're in the theater. Now, that technology is only getting better. So eventually, if that venue is available to all filmmakers and they can hold their own screenings for the world, then that might inspire them to do exactly what you're saying.
yeah, it's no, it's extraordinary. I've sat in on I've used some. A friend of mine had some of that VR technology, and I did some of the stuff where you sit, and this was years ago, and it was still looking pretty darn good. Where you could sit in a theater, and it would, you know, you would see the movie from the angle in the theater, like with keystoning and everything, um, that you would if you were in an actual theater. Um, I think um, I think what we're dealing with is just this is kind of a Wild West period. Things are mutating. That's the word I keep using. It's mutating. It's not dying. It's just mutating. People still love going to theaters. Um, but I think home theaters are getting so much better. I think that's a major contributor to things changing. I'm astounded at how good some of my friends' home theaters are. So, um, you know, why would you want to go to a theater for a lot of people? Why would you want to go and have to deal with parking and traffic and all that other stuff, and then pay $15 for the movie and then $50 for popcorn or whatever and so forth, and then have to tell some kid to turn their cell phone off? You know, but when you've got it, when you can get a great system at home with great sound and everything else. So, but it's just, again, I don't quite know where I'm going with this, but it's mutating. Everything's mutating. The means of production, the means of distribution, everything.
Sure, and there could be some familiar aspects, for instance, and I'm sure you recall, and also historically, you've done quite a bit of research on it. Can you take us back to the drive-in era? And I know there were several decades that had it, but let's say the 1970s is really where it peaked. Um, What kind of movies were being made in that era that really changed the world and blew people away, that were played at drive-ins?
Drive-ins drew a very youthful audience. Not necessarily primarily a youthful audience, but a huge audience of youngsters who wanted to get out of their house, who had cars. America was prospering. They just wanted to go there, hang out with their buddies or make out or whatever. And among others, Herman Cohen, that was working with American International, saw that there was this huge market for these kinds of movies. And so he did I Was a Teenage Werewolf and other teen oriented movies where the adult was the antagonist and the teenager was kind of the misunderstood monster and so forth. And he made a fortune on them. And so often the movies that were aimed at drive-ins were either aimed at younger audiences. They were usually cruder, cheaper. They weren't intended to stay long. Um, they, for 1 week only, or they would just pop up and pop out. Um, and they were usually something that the majors wouldn't touch, whether it had to do with something violent or sexy or whatever. Um, but of course, Roger Corman, really, really started his career there. I mean, and stayed in the drive-ins and became, kind of the pope of the drive-in. Um, and these were usually fast-paced, very entertaining, gory, titillating, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes fantastic movies. And I'm trying to think of the drive-in movies that really, really changed things. I think the AIP movies, the movies Corman did. I like I Was a Teenage Werewolf much better than Rebel Without a Cause. And I don't say that ironically because I sympathize so much more with Michael Landon's character.
Now that was a very
Um,
popular movie when it came out, right? And it's odd that it hasn't really had a proper restoration
I'll
release
tell
that I
you
know.
why. I can tell you exactly why. Susan Hart, the widow of Jim Nicholson, that was vice president of American International, controls the rights to it, and she keeps demanding too much money whenever anybody tries to re-release it. She keeps demanding more money than anybody wants to pay.
That's a shame. And what
It's
happens when
terrible.
she leaves the earth?
I'll bet you someone related to her, whoever inherits her stuff, will probably put it out in a minute. It's a terrible shame. I don't think she realizes that instead of, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people's opinions, instead of carrying on the memory of Jim Nicholson through these films, she's erasing them. They're vanishing from the popular consciousness because they're not being revived. And you can see them on YouTube. People have just, taken the old VHS tapes and burned them to DVD. But I'm trying to think the drive-in movies.
I know Night of the Living Dead was certainly one of them, right?
Yeah, Night of the Living Dead, absolutely. Texas Chainsaw would be another one. So much stuff played at the drive-ins. There were, like adults only drive-ins that were showing like sexploitation movies. There were of course trends. They would go through these trends. You'd have, for a while it would be juvenile delinquent movies, and for a while it would be monster movies, and for a while it would be biker movies and acid movies and drug movies and so forth. There's so many that I love. There are so many cheap, fast, quickly made, inexpensive and extremely entertaining movies that I never ever tire of.
Well, one of your favorites, one of the most explosive, I think, literally balls out movie was George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead. And tell me about, I mean, maybe your first experience wasn't at a drive-in, but what was your first experience seeing a movie like that?
Oh, I think Dawn of the Dead specifically, I don't I don't think I had seen anything quite like Dawn when I first discovered it. I had really, really fallen in love with Creepshow. I loved that movie. This is going back to when I was about in middle school. And I love Creepshow. It was one of my favorite movies, and I was just crazy about it. I had the soundtrack album, just nuts over it. And I remember I had some friends over from school, and my brother and his girlfriend were going out to get to rent a movie, and they said, "What would you like?" And I said, "Get Creepshow, get Creepshow." So he comes back with Dawn of the Dead. I was kind of disappointed. I was like, "Oh, what's that?" And he put it in, and everyone there was completely gripped by it. We were completely into it. And it's so satisfying when there are movies you discover as a kid that you love, that all your instincts are telling you to love. And as you get older, um, you grow to like it for even more reasons. As you learn what went into it, as you discover whole new dimensions to it. Alien is a movie like that for me. It's a
Sure, the
movie that
original.
yeah, the original. I loved it as a kid, and I still adore it, but for even more reasons. Things I never could have picked up on as a kid. But Dawn of the Dead's like that. Dawn of the Dead is, I mean, to me, is one of the great. It's a great American film on every level, not just a great American regional film. It's just a great American film. The imagination, the audacity of that movie. It's like, in the 1930s King Kong, the plot keeps upping the ante, you know? They go to, "All right, we're traveling to Skull Island. All right, we're gonna fight a bunch of dinosaurs. Okay, we're gonna raise the ante. Now this giant gorilla is gonna show up, and he's gonna fight the dinosaurs. And now we're gonna capture the gorilla. Oh, and now we're gonna take him back to New York, and now he's gonna go on a rampage, and now he's gonna climb the Empire State Building." And they keep raising the ante and raising the ante and raising the ante. And it's so exciting and so unpredictable. It's the same with Dawn of the Dead.
Well, then you
You
must agree there has to be some kind of payoff in movies, period. And my favorites always seem to have that one way or another, even if it's a slow burn until Act Three.
Yeah.
Somehow I don't even want to say redeems itself. It pays off. It's giving you so much towards the end. And I think the worst failure of a movie is to give you nothing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And also, there's a wonderful quote that Rudolph Gray used in his book on Ed Wood. Um, it's from Carl Dreyer, the Danish director, and he said, "The imperfect is alive." And I have seen so many movies that cost 100 million or $200 million that were cleanly made and obviously expensive, and they obviously spent a ton of money and time on them. And I was so bored and indifferent to them, I couldn't wait for them to end. I never wanted to see them again. But you take a movie like Dawn of the Dead that's made with such skill, wit, um, imagination, humor. It has such a great sense of humor, humanity, um, just storytelling acumen, and that's so unpredictable and so interesting, and it just never lets up. Um, and it was made for what I think, like, suppose the figure you always hear is 3 million. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what you always hear bandied around. Um, that's like nothing. It's all about the people who make them. And again, I may have said this earlier, but economy is an artistic virtue. Economy is an artistic virtue. There are so many great low budget films in American history that don't need a higher budget.
Of course. Yeah, no, it's the mother of invention. It forces you into this area of creativity that
Well, also, and sometimes it really works to your advantage. Like, I say this, but the one of the things that I picked up on as a kid watching, and I like this about regional movies in general, but I especially like it about Dawn. The zombies in it look like people you and I know. They look like people you run into the street. It could be your uncle. It could be a mechanic you know. It could be a grocer. It could be, a janitor. Just people that you see and know, you know, and because it's just locals. He just had locals coming in from Pennsylvania, and this may sound like I'm splitting hairs a little bit, but in the remake of Dawn of the Dead, to me, the zombies look like out of work actors. They look like extras. It didn't just seem like random people like you'd see in a zombie apocalypse.
and here Okay, so and again, since then, obviously in recent years, there's everybody and their mother has tried to make some kind of independent zombie movie, but rarely, if ever, does anyone even get close. And you were correct earlier when you said it's the person, it's the time and place in the world, it's their skills coupled with their maturity and their perspective. And there was so much being said in Dawn of the Dead at that time, and there wasn't anything like it. Now, at that time, and it's hard for people who are younger now to understand what it was like for us to see that stuff because it was so unique. There was no way we would foresee one of the most popular television series, and there's several of them now, being a ripoff of Dawn of the Dead, essentially, with Greg Nicotero being the showrunner.
You know what? No, Walking Dead is it owes so much to Romero. And I the funniest I'm going to digress for a second. The funniest criticism I've heard of Walking Dead is, why are there no flies? There's hordes of I get it from a practical standpoint, but there's hordes of rotting walking corpses in Georgia, which is a ridiculously hot state. You would hear the flies buzzing from a mile away. They'd be all over them. But and that's something Romero actually dealt with that. You hear the flies. You hear the flies in, like, I think Day of the Dead and some of the others, which is only logical. No, everybody owes Romero. Everybody owes Romero. And I think even something like what's the one? What's the show about the is it The Last of Us? The one about the fungus that gets loose?
Yes, yes.
Last of Us, yeah, which I enjoyed really. I really enjoyed that show. But I'm sitting here and I'm going, this is so much a Romero. It's like Romero on a bigger budget. But I think to do Walking Dead, I think Greg is absolutely his Romero credentials are rock solid. Well, it's funny, and before him though is I Am Legend. It was Matheson's I Am Legend that inspired Night of the Living Dead in a lot of ways.
Correct. Yeah, it was
And
Last
so
Man, Last Man on Earth. No.
yeah, exactly, and Last Man on Earth, and I remember seeing Last Man on Earth for the first time as a teenager and thinking, "Oh my god, like this is so much like Night of the Living Dead." The movie, not Last Man on Earth, even more so than Romero's than Matheson's novel. But it's funny how certain stories, certain tropes they just grow and grow and grow, and just continue right on from generation to generation.
Of
Um,
course. One thing I wanted to ask you, and I think I know the answer to this, that there were a series of movies, including Blade Runner, John Carpenter's The Thing, when we were kids, that were smashed by critics, by the studios. People almost lost their jobs in the process. John Carpenter was fired. But when you saw those as a kid, did you know they were brilliant even then?
You know what's funny? I saw The Thing and Blade I saw The Thing when I was probably about 12 or 13 for the first time. And I saw Blade Runner for the first time when I was about 15. And I saw a very crappy doopy copy of The Thing, so I didn't really get to judge it properly. Although the kind of crappiness and doopiness sort of added to the nasty biological look of the thing in a way. Blade Runner, I saw that terrible the cut with that stupid the narration and everything. Um, Television was not the best place to see either of those films for the first time, and I wasn't that into them as a youngster. I always liked The Thing, but it was never really my favorite Carpenter movie. I like it. It's a very solid film. Um, but it took me a while for it to grow on me. It really grew on me. Blade Runner the same way. Seeing Blade Runner in a theater on a huge theater screen makes all the difference. It's spectacular. That thing, it is an art director's movie through and through. The attention to detail in it is incredible. What Doug Trumbull did, what Sid Mead did, all of those guys, it's just extraordinary. The level of detail. I love world building when that much thought and time and care is put into it. Back to what you were saying about the critics, man, what the critics did to Carpenter's The Thing, Hitler did to Poland. I mean, it was awful. They were, I mean, they dogpiled on it. Those reviews are so incredibly unnecessarily. They used unnecessary roughness. It's really below the belt. It was the same thing that the critics did to Todd Browning's Freaks. It's the same thing that critics did to Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, both of which are now horror classics of their eras. But the critics just chose. They really thought, okay, we hate the thing. We really hate it, and I don't really get it. And also writers. I mean, I remember Harlan Ellison trashing it, and I think some people really got it. I think some people got that movie. Um, there's the great ballet movie, The Red Shoes, and probably 10,000 young girls have decided to become ballerinas because of seeing The Red Shoes. By the same token, probably 10,000 young guys have decided to become effects artists because of Rob Bottin's effects in The Thing. And of course, now everybody raves about The Thing. I mean, everywhere if you bring that movie up, people are like, "Oh, that's one of my favorite movies." Well, it has grown and grown and grown and grown and grown. And but yeah, they were, God, the critics were really, really bad about them. I think in the case of Blade Runner, it was just too far ahead. They didn't it was too much for people, for the average person to really grasp or try to grasp.
Right, and its greatest example wasn't released on its first run. I mean, I think that
Exactly.
director's cut was better. But there was another movie that was a little earlier, which was William Friedkin's Sorcerer.
Yeah, you know what did it? Okay, what did it in was it was several things. I love Sorcerer. I think it's a fantastic movie. It's uh it's it's not really a remake of The Wages of Fear. They are both from the same novel. So I don't really consider it a remake, like in the sense of, it's this, by the same token, I don't think John Carpenter's The Thing is a remake of Howard Hawks's The Thing, because it goes back to the original source story. Who goes there? Sorcerer, what threw people, I think, with Sorcerer was Friedkin, of course, had created one of the most popular horror films of all time with The Exorcist. So what's his next movie? It's called Sorcerer, and people think, "Oh, it's gonna be about this fanciful wizard, casting the runes and turning people into newts and all this supernatural mayhem." I mean, it's what you'd think from that title, but that's actually the name of the truck. That's the name of, as I recall, Roy Scheider's truck in the film, because all the trucks in that Friedkin was seeing in South America had all these names. Like one's called Lazarus, I think. But anyway, also, they spent a ton of money on that movie. They spent a ton of money on that film, and it
Sure, and
shows.
risk and
Oh,
things that
Jesus,
people
like, I
wouldn't
mean,
do
no, the
today.
riskiness of that thing with, again, that's a great one to see with an audience. The part where the big scene where they are moving the dynamite truck across the rickety bridge during monsoon season or whatever is, audiences just, I mean, there's one moment in that scene where I remember watching it in the theater, and it just this one kind of jolting moment in it, and I could just hear a girl a few rows back go, just gasp, like loudly, audibly gasp. And but they spent a lot of money on it. People didn't quite know what to make of it, and it came out right around the time of Star Wars, and Star Wars just blew everything out of the
And
water at that
speaking of
point.
which, were you, naturally, you probably were a Star Wars fan when you were a kid, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I
Okay.
think I think every one of our era was the I had the toys, of course. I love the Kenner toys. I love the movies. I think when I was about 13 or so, I started paying attention to the dialogue in Star Wars, and I was like, "This is really stupid." I mean, this is kid stuff. This is really kid stuff. And I had the same reaction to comic books, like superhero comic books. I was like, "This is kid stuff," you know. And in the technical terms, I mean, the Star Wars films are incredible. I mean, all of the technical side of things is phenomenal. What the effects guys, ILM and Phil Tippett and all those guys did, and Stuart Freeborn with the makeup, and Ben Burt with the sound effects, which of course are now part of our, this is all part of our pop lexicon. Um, and they're very well made movies, but they're kid stuff. And I but yeah, I loved him as a kid. Absolutely loved him.
Well, what from that time period completely transported you and that you haven't lost any love for, essentially? You that it has its magic hasn't worn off on you.
There are quite a few. One that I love going back to is Frank Oz's Little Shop of Horrors, the musical Little Shop of Horrors. Um, I I saw it twice first run in the theater as a kid and just loved it. Absolutely loved it. I had never seen a kind of I don't know if I'd ever seen anything quite a comedy quite that macabre. Or I think, black comedy was just starting to register with me as a little kid, and, the puppetry and everything just absolutely blew me away. I mean, Lyle Conway is that did the puppets and the plants in it, is like the Mozart of animatronics. I mean, the guy is unbelievably gifted, incredibly gifted artist.
That's a great movie. It has a little bit of John Landis DNA in it, no?
It does it? I don't it's sort of I it yeah, I think, he and Oz having worked together, I think there's a certain amount of that. It has a sense of humor that's as good as his best comedies. The what was it? But I remember what was it? I didn't see Little Shop again from beginning to end for many years, and some friends of mine put it on, and I'm watching it and just going and falling in love with it all over again. I loved everything about it. And it's so much of it is the performers doing. Rick Moranis is phenomenal. Ellen Green, um, what's his name? Plays Mr. Mushnick. Vincent Gardenia, Steve Martin, Bill Murray. I mean, everybody in it is so great. The three girls, the three singers, are just marvelous. But of course, like it just works on so many levels. I'm not as crazy about the director's cut with the incredibly dark ending, although it's beautifully done. But I do love that film, and I'm amazed every time I see it how real and alive Audrey 2 or Audrey Jr. Audrey 2 the puppet is. It's Audrey Jr. in the original Little Shop, but Audrey 2 is, and how much expression they get out of that the plant puppet with no eyes. It's no
It's
eyes and no face. It's incredible how much expressiveness they get out with body language and so forth. It's masterful puppeteering.
Yeah, I truly enjoy that movie as well. I heard recently that Joe Dante was making Little Shop of Horrors. Did you hear
It's
that?
some kind of yeah, it's some kind of TV show called something like Little Shop of Halloween Horrors, I think. That's about all I know. I mean, if anybody would respect and venerate the original Little Shop, it's Joe because I think he has a print of it. He has he and some other collectors, John Davison and some others have prints that they keep with the Academy, and they screened it not too long ago in 35 millimeter, and it was, I believe, from Joe and John's collection. And of course, what I love about the Frank Oz Little Shop is it's such a different animal from the Roger Corman version. So it's like they're both marvelous in their own ways. That would be one. Another one would be Something Wicked This Way Comes. I absolutely love Something Wicked This Way Comes.
Tell us about your first experience with that. And obviously, I know you're a huge Ray Bradbury fan, and you even knew him. No?
Yeah, was acquainted. I interviewed him and met him a whole bunch of times and got to know him a little bit. He was very accessible and very friendly, and he was a really cool guy. But Something Wicked was that and the Ray Bradbury Theater on HBO were my introductions to Ray's work, the dramatic versions of Ray's work. And Something Wicked was done when Disney was going through their dark period, where they were making all these really interesting dark stories, like Return to Oz and
Watcher in the Woods.
Watcher in the Woods, exactly, The Black Hole and Black Cauldron. I mean, these were dark, really interesting dark stories. And Something Wicked was I didn't know really what I couldn't I didn't really know what costume design was. I didn't really know what art direction was or any of those things. But I was responding to all of those things in Something Wicked. It's a beautifully designed movie. It's a beautifully shot movie. And there's a really deep humanity to that film. And also, I mean, the actors in it. Again, I go back to the actors. That's a lot of what makes some of the best fantasy and science fiction and horror films is really rock solid casts. And all of those actors, those great actors, Jason Robards, Jonathan Pryce, Royal Dano, Pam Grier in one of her best roles, they got Ray Bradbury's dialogue, which is not necessarily easy to speak. And it's I just love that film on every level. I that had a big impact on me as a kid.
At what point did, because all of these films blew you away. I mean, most of your cinema experiences, one way or another, provoked thought, made you want to keep going back, made you want to go back to the video store, wherever you were absorbing the movies. But there was one turning point where you wanted to reach out and meet people that were either making or that were in the films. And I think that's continued to this day. You've befriended quite a few people in some
Yeah,
of your
no,
favorite movies.
I think what happened was I was growing up in a kind of I wanted to get out. I didn't really like my hometown, and I found it very boring. And I was very curious about the movie world, and I wanted to talk to movie people, and I wanted to pick their brains and see how you get into the movies and find out all these things and just find out a lot about and talk to them about their movies that I loved. And I realized at a very early age that I thought, okay, a lot of the movies I love are very, very old, and the people who made them are very old now. And if I don't talk to them now, I'll never get a chance. And so I was able to find addresses on a lot of people, mailing addresses, and in some cases, phone numbers. I would just call up 411 in Los Angeles and say, do you have a number for Gene Fowler Jr., who directed I Was a Teenage Werewolf? And they'd give it to me, and I would call him up and say, can I interview you? And he'd say, sure. And what inspired a lot of that was there's a great scene in the movie Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, where Joan Crawford is the elderly wheelchair bound actress who hasn't done a movie in many, many years, and she gets a fan letter. And she's so excited. She's so happy. It says, "Oh, I just saw your film on TV the other day. It's Moonglow, I think it's called, something like that. And oh, I just thought you were marvelous." And she's so happy. And all of a sudden, it clicked with me. I mean, I knew no one in the film industry, no one. My family had no connections whatsoever. And I think the only person I knew that was even remotely connected to it was Forrest J. Ackerman, the editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland, who I had met at a convention and had been corresponding with, like a million other kids with an interest in this stuff. And but that scene in Baby Jane made me realize, wait a second, these people would like it if I wrote them a letter and told them how much I enjoy their work. Like I hadn't even thought of that. So especially someone that was like I was like 14 years old, 15 years old, whatever. And I think a lot of them were astonished that a kid that young would be interested in them. And so I could kind of play the cute kid card, that's or cute adolescent card. And so I the first person I ever corresponded with in the industry was the great Dick Miller, great character actor of so many Roger Corman movies. And I mean, Dick was, I mean, one of the great character actors of the last 60, 70 years. I mean, and he was a lovely, lovely guy. And we corresponded, and Fari Ackerman started forwarding letters for me. And I would get autographed photos from actors and stuff, and I would correspond with some of them. And that just sort of grew and grew. Because again, like I mean, I was in a really boring town, and so the mailbox and the telephone were my window into a bigger world. And I used both of them for all they were worth. I mean, the first time I started doing interviews when I was 15 for a magazine called Psychotronic Video. It was put out by Michael J. Weldon that wrote the Psychotronic Encyclopedia of Film. It's a really indispensable book. First person I interviewed was Royal Dano, that was in Something Wicked. It's actually Royal's last interview. He passed away not long after that, and I just started going from there. And it was fascinating when you get to know people that worked on movies you love, and you can have long talks with them and really pick their brain about them. You get an entirely different perspective on films and what really goes into them. You know, not a fantasy of what making movies is like, but what it's really like. And I got to know more and more and more of these older movie people, and that made it easier for me to connect to other people because I developed a history with them, and and my instincts were right. A lot of the older movie people are gone now, and I look back and I had a lot of friendships that you know are impossible now. They're gone, you know, and I really treasure that.
And you mostly had pleasant experiences. Was there ever an encounter that, and I'm not trying to bring negativity to the table, but let's say an odd encounter or almost dangerous encounter?
I won't say dangerous, but I'll tell you a funny story. So, Stanley Cortez is a brilliant cinematographer, great cinematographer. He shot Magnificent Ambersons for Orson Welles. He shot Night of the Hunter. Um, Shot Sam Fuller's The Naked Kiss and shot Corridor. Extraordinary cinematographer. He was the original cinematographer on Chinatown and got fired. I got his number when he was about 88, and uh, it was just listed. And I called him up, and the old bastard hung up on me twice. I will never forget it. I didn't was not calling him late, and I called and and he answers. And he goes, hello. I said, is this Stanley Cortez? Yes. Well, hi, my name's Justin Humphreys, and I just wanted to say I really love Night of the Click. And I thought, oh, what up? So I called him back like a minute later. He goes, hello? Is this Stanley Cortez? Yes. Hi, my name's Justin Humphreys. What the hell do you mean calling me this time of night? And I was like, oh, well, I just want to say I really love Night of the Hunter. And I was like, no, I'm sick. Go away. Click. Was basically how it went. And I found out later, I heard from people that had known him back in the day. Apparently he could be extremely curmudgeonly and extremely standoffish. And but I love the guy's work. I mean, I will not say a negative thing about. I mean, you know, Ambersons and Night of the Hunter alone.
I mean, Night of the Hunter, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and
Charles
also
Laughton's only movie, correct?
His only movie as director, and it's it's a masterpiece. And now they're talking about remaking that, which is offensive on every level.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
In 1968, George Romero brought us Night of the Living Dead. It became the classic horror film of its time.
It gets up and kills. The people it kills get up and kill.
Now, George Romero brings us the most intensely shocking motion picture experience for all times. Dawn of the Dead.
This situation must be controlled before it's too late. They are multiplying too rapidly.
Night of the Living Dead has ended. Dawn of the Dead is here.
Not that room, not that room! They must be destroyed on sight.
Dawn of the Dead. This picture contains scenes of violence that may be considered shocking. No one under 17 will be admitted. Dawn of the Dead. From United Film Distributing Company.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Well, Justin, wouldn't you see this as a golden opportunity for creative people? While the studios are remaking everything, they're even bringing Halloween back, even though it ended 25 times,
Yeah.
and they're making more superhero movies, and they're remaking television shows into movies, and it's just gone off the rails. Isn't this the perfect time to make Easy Rider, Taxi Driver, like everything you could think, and I don't mean remake those movies. I mean something as
Yeah,
powerful.
something that inventive and original. That's what I mean, and I'm surprised more people aren't doing it. I think again, people are scared to take chances. I think people are. Um, it's I don't know. I've and again, it's easy. It's the materials are so much easier to work with. It's so much cheaper than it used to be. Why aren't they doing it? Why isn't somebody doing an animated movie like Yellow Submarine now? It's just that movie is pure unfettered imagination. And I mean, it I don't know. I don't get it. I think also audiences have lost a certain amount of their sophistication. I think a lot of audiences have. And that may sound kind of condescending of me, but I think it's true. I don't think audiences come to movies now with um they come at it in a different way. I think there's a lot more jadedness. I see more jadedness when people go to the movies. Um, I
In some cases, you're 100% correct, but in others, I mean, I didn't see Oppenheimer. Did you?
I did. It was I thought it was really overrated.
Okay,
Very
I didn't have a
overrated.
chance to see it, and I honestly, I have nothing against Christopher Nolan. I just haven't. I didn't see his last three movies.
Yeah, I mean, I do think he's overrated. I thought Dunkirk was just too rambling. There were too many characters. I mean, look, he's the one with the Oscars and the millions, so who am I to criticize? I don't think he's losing sleep for me taking pot shots at him. But Oppenheimer had a lot of problems, and I think if I've been telling people just skip it and watch. There's a wonderful documentary from the '80s called The Day After Trinity about Oppenheimer, and it told Oppenheimer's story much more powerfully in about 90 minutes. And I wasn't. I mean, look, I've been fascinated by the atomic bomb since I was a kid. I've even been to Trinity. I have stood in the spot where the first atomic bomb went off, and I am my own nightlight now. So, but I don't I don't know. I thought it was too long, and it had no sense of period dialogue. I mean, there people spoke differently in those days. And there's all these little things. People spoke differently in the '40s than they did in the '70s, and people spoke differently in the 1940s than they did in 1890, and so forth. And people either have an ear for that kind of speech or they don't. And it just had a complete 10-year to period dialogue, and I found that very off-putting.
What
But
recent movies do you think really does hit the mark? I mean, as eventful films go, do you think Quentin Tarantino's last few movies were pretty decent?
um, I have mixed feelings. I have mixed feelings. I the last the last few movies that really impressed me, I loved Godzilla minus one. I thought Godzilla minus one was fantastic. It's very traditional, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I was gripped by it. I loved it. And I would tell people how good it was, and they'd kind of laugh, and I'd say, look, it's not, Godzilla versus Megalon. This is not a childish Godzilla movie like in the '70s. This is like something much darker and more sober and more adult, like the original 1954 Godzilla. And I kept telling them, trying to put it in terms they could understand, and I'd say, it's it's not a goofy '70s kiddie Godzilla, which I also love, but it's a gripping drama of post-war life in Japan with a giant lizard in it, which it is. And I love that. There are a few others, few from last year that really, really struck me. I thought the creator was pretty good. It was very derivative, very derivative. It's a science fiction film last year that it was Gareth Edwards did. Um, but there were parts in it that really impressed me. Um, but again, it was that didn't really blow me away. I haven't seen much in the last year that really just floored me. That
Going
really,
back a
really.
little further, what about movies like There Will Be Blood?
Um, I have mixed feelings about that too. I thought the art direction. My favorite part of it was the art direction by Jack Fisk. I mean, what Jack Fisk does. I mean, that guy is. He's incredible. He's absolutely one of the best art directors we have going. When he creates a historic period, he packs it with so densely with period detail, and he goes to such his sense of history, the level of research that he puts into his work is so extraordinary. I thought that was the best part of it. Um, I think I felt like Paul Thomas Anderson was letting the actors get a bit carried away. That I found kind of off-putting. Um, I couldn't really. I had a hard time getting into it. I really didn't like Licorice Pizza. I really didn't like
Didn't
that.
have a chance to see that one yet.
It just it doesn't work for a lot of reasons. I mean, to my taste. But
Is
the
there, outside of the recent Godzilla film, and I haven't had a chance to check it out, do you feel like there's something, a director or a motion picture that really captures that magic that you felt when you were younger, or that you still feel from older films?
You know what? I'll tell you. I everything that Aardman has been doing, Aardman Animation in England, what they have done with stop motion constantly amazes me. Their features, their TV, Shaun the Sheep, things like that. I mean, there's something wonderful about it. There's this whimsical, playful quality to it, and this brilliant sense of humor, and this incredible dexterity with the animation. I think they're wonderful. I think they're just wonderful. Everything they've done. Something that catches the magic. That's a tough call. Hardman's a big one. I don't know. Not a lot. There'll be moments here and there. There'll be scenes here and there. But in general, not really. Not really. But that's a very good question. I'd actually have to think about that.
Something tells me eventually that it is possible we could take a leap forward and recapture that magic as creators, right? And give it back to the audience again. But how do you speak to a culture right now? Because it's not it's a very divided culture. So who are you speaking to? And then are you taking the risk to speak? We're in a time right now that's very risky to say what's on your mind because you might be judged. And if you're judged the wrong way, you might be canceled. Do you have those fears at all for movie makers, or do you
I
think
do.
movie?
No, I definitely do. I definitely do, and definitely for films that get radically misunderstood. Um, I have that do in writing about film history, which I do a lot of. I run across films that have gotten an unnecessarily bad rep. Um, like I'll give you for an example. I just wrote this book last year about George Powell, who of course was the father of the modern science fiction film. Um, and My favorite of his features is Seven Faces of Dr. Lowe, which is a great film fantasy based on a great fantasy novel, The Circus of Dr. Lowe by Charles G. Finney. And in the film, Tony Randall plays a Chinese magician who runs the greatest circus in the world, and Randall plays all of the members of the circus. And it was the first film to win an Academy Award for makeup. Bill Tuttle won it, and the film has the term that keeps getting applied to the film is yellow face. They keep saying, "Oh, Tony Randall's in yellow face," and he does the character of Dr. Lowe. If you watch the film, is the hero. He saves everybody. He's wonderful. I don't know if anyone on the planet Earth ever left the Seven Faces of Dr. Lowe not loving that character. And there are scenes in the movie where there's these two horrible redneck thugs that work for Arthur O'Connell's character, and they harass a Native American and use slurs towards Native Americans and so forth. And and Dr. Lowe comes along and saves him from these two hicks that are attacking him, and he was actually played by a Native American, not someone in makeup. And it's a patently unracist movie on every level. It is so not racist. Dr. Lowe, his accent changes from character to character, from whoever he's dealing with. He speaks to people the way they expect him to speak. Like there's a little boy in it who sees him as this sort of sage or wise man, and he speaks in this sort of beautiful, dulcet way with perfect English. And then when he's dealing with these rednecks, he speaks in broken, kind of pigeon accented English. And part of it is trickery. He is a trickster. This is what he does. And it's not racist. It is not a racist film on any level. And every time I give a talk about PAL, I will always say that. And I'm so like if you punch in a while ago, I punched in Seven Faces of Dr. Lowe into Google, and the first thing that pops up is Seven Faces of Dr. Lowe racist. And it's because a lot of people refuse to look at things in context. I was talking to a Chinese American friend of mine who is a TV historian, and I said, "What do you think about Tony Randall wearing the makeup? And do you find this racist, whatever?" And he goes, "It's all about context." And he didn't find Dr. Lowe racist at all. On the other hand, you have something like, what's his name, Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's, who's doing this absolutely grotesque imitation of a Japanese man, which is like something a third grader would do. And that I can, if somebody's going to say that's racist, yeah, I can believe that. Yeah, that is racist. But in the case of Dr. Lowe, it's something very different. And I think a lot of people have on I think both sides of the political spectrum have come to look at things with blinders. They look at that something as either um, it's for my political football team or it's against my political football team. And there's no in between and there's no bipartisanship and all of this. And it's affected the arts really badly. And I do agree. I think a lot of people are afraid to say things in movies. They're afraid to do things in movies. This is why we don't get filmmakers like, Ralph Bakshi or Ken Russell anymore. You know, really wild, fearless filmmakers.
I believe okay, and I think you believe this too, that we must be on the precipice of that, because usually to one extreme causes a reaction, a rebellion, especially
Yeah, the
with
pendulum.
artists.
It's a pendulum. It's a pendulum swinging. It's a pendulum swinging. Um, it's you can it once you take it too far in one direction, it will go in the other direction. I had a friend. It was funny. I was talking to a guy. Some writers were together, and one guy made a very funny remark. He said what somebody should do is get a black comedian and a white comedian and $5 million and make the most epically politically incorrect comedy you can think of. And you'd probably make a fortune on it because I think people would be so relieved to see something incredibly politically incorrect because I think a lot of it is self-censorship. It's people putting leg irons on themselves and silencing themselves because there are no laws about a lot of these things in terms of the arts. I think people are really afraid to be wide open in the arts. Um, you have filmmakers like David Cronenberg or John Waters who are more liberal than liberal. I mean, they make you realize just how restrictive so-called liberals can be. And I remember John Waters saying once that what was it? He said I've spent a lot of my career offending liberals because they're the easiest people to offend. I think going after conservatives in the audience is very very easy. And I think that's there's been a lot of I think both sides have gotten so strange. It's become so loaded and divisive.
Yeah, not to get into conspiracy territory, but do you think often these these divisions are induced by a third party that's more in the shadows behind the curtain?
I don't think it's a third party. I think it's just the media has gotten so that you have the loudest people getting the most bandwidth. So instead of having well-spoken opponents on either side, on on the right you get Rush Limbaugh, and on the left you get Michael Moore. It's like the worst of either side, shrieking and lying, and just making a mess of everything for everybody. Then nobody. You know what's funny? And this reminds me of something George Romero talked about. He was talking about how in like the beginning of Dawn of the Dead, in the news where they're having it's a news broadcast going horribly awry, and it's just two guys yelling at each other. Nobody's really listening to each other. They're just basically yelling at each other. And they're barely speaking calmly to each other. Or in Day of the Dead, the film after that, where it's just a lot of people there. It's these, soldiers and scientists trapped in this underground bunker. And rather than trying to pool their resources and work things out and solve things, they're just yelling at each other and nobody's listening. And I think of that so often. Romero was very prescient to point that out because there's so much on both sides of people just yelling at each other, just yelling and yelling at each other and not really getting anywhere. Again, I point to like no bipartisanship. I blame the media. I mean, like the media during I'm not into conspiracy theories, but I have to say during the pandemic, the news media should have been horsewhipped for the way that they were crushing people's spirits,
And you're the
crushing
perfect
people's spirits.
you just mentioned it, and you're the perfect person to imagine this scenario. And I do know that um, George Romero's second wife or third wife, Suzanne, is now given the rights over to Brad Anderson to make "quote unquote" a George Romero's last movie, Twilight of the Dead. However, if Romero was alive today, and he might make an amazing film, so it remains to be seen. But if George Romero was alive today, and let's say this was the George Romero of Dawn of the Dead or Day of the Dead, how do you
Yeah.
think he would approach if this was a dream scenario? Because I don't know if Brad Anderson will approach it like George did. You never know. He might. I
Right.
hope he
Right.
does, because he
Right.
has that key in his hand right now, and he should. But how would George do this right now? Because this would have been George's greatest attempt. He would have said something. He must have.
I think it would be very funny. I mean, however dark it got, I think it would be very funny. Um, and that's my general response. And I think that's something that Romero got that a lot of filmmakers could learn from. There was Romero. I'm digressing a little bit here, but Romero and Stephen King and Steven Spielberg at their best have a level of identification with the audience that's extraordinary. An audience of just average people, and I say this in the like I don't mean that in a condescending way. I just mean bringing an audience of just a totally random audience. Um, and the same goes for Spielberg at his best, and same goes for Stephen King's fiction. It's like they are one of you. This is not a millionaire or someone that's been completely divorced from ordinary society. This is someone that gets that's one of you, and they are telling you a story that you can relate to. And I think that was one of Romero's great gifts. The fact that he came, as far as I know, he came from a fairly blue collar background. I think that's one of the reasons why his movies have continued to work so well. Just at a level of human identification. Um, I don't know if he'd do something much grimmer. I don't think he would be happy with the way things are right now. I was just watching an old interview with him when they were doing Day of the Dead, and he was talking about how he said, he goes, kids now, this is 1985, and he's saying, kids now are having to learn about duck and cover and being afraid of the bomb and all this stuff like when I was a kid. And I thought, well, Jesus Christ, that's happening now. It's like we're terrified of World War III now. And I don't think Romero would be very happy with with how things turned out. I think there was something about Romero that I'm digressing a bit here again, but there's something about the best of American democracy. I think he he was a deeply American filmmaker, and like a lot of great, deeply American filmmakers, he saw what was wrong with America, and he immediately went after it. And but I would love to see what Romero could have done with a gigantic budget and with the level of skill and everything that he had when he was doing. You know what? I mean, he and Stephen King, were planning on doing The Stand in the early '80s. And I think what they would have done with it then would have been, if especially, I mean, my God, to see them. I don't know if they could have told the story in 2 hours or 2.5 hours, and that was probably one of the reasons that it got sunk. But I mean, what they could have done with it would have been, I mean, just spectacular. It's a very Romero story.
Very much. He also had his hands on it, and he turned it down for the same reasons that he could not make something in a 2.5 hour period. He couldn't do it.
Well, that was the long. It's funny. I just there's a new book. There's a second edition of a book on the making of Salem's Lot coming out in the near future from Centipede Press, and I contributed a lot of material to it. And one of the things that was one of the big problems they had with Salem's Lot. One of the reasons it took so long to get Salem's Lot off the ground was because it's a 2 or 3 part miniseries. You can't do it as a 2 hour, 2.5 hour movie. I think they've just done it with this new version, which apparently is pretty good. But it's so much. You're trying to shoehorn too much in. I think that was one of the big problems with Ghost Story. Have you read Peter Straub's Ghost Story?
I never read Straub's book, but I did see the movie, of course.
Okay, the book is 1,000 times better. It's 1,000 times better, which is sad because the movie has a great cast, it has a great crew, great music, great effects by Dick Smith, costumes by May Routh, Albert Whitlock doing matte paintings, all of these amazingly talented people. But and Alice Krige is perfect as the villainess in it. The problem is, you read the book and it's a 6 or 7 hour story, and it's much richer and it's much more complex, and it's a story that works really well as a novel. There are certain things that just shouldn't be adapted to film because they work so well in their own medium. Um, but yeah, there are certain stories that just you can't do in 2 or 2.5 hours, not successfully.
No, and so okay, so that lens. Now, how do you feel about that becoming today's zeitgeist, and people are watching 9 seasons or 5 seasons of this ongoing story for television? It's an ongoing movie, essentially. So anything that couldn't have been adapted
Oh,
at
can
that
be. Oh,
time,
yeah. Yeah. No, I'm
but
all for it. I'm all for it. The series format. I just don't watch a lot of TV series, ongoing weekly TV series, because I love the concise cinematic format so much.
likewise.
I love a story being told in which also ties in. I mean, most of the television that I watch is old omnibus series. It's old anthology series. I should say anthology series. Um, Twilight Zone or Thriller or Outer Limits or Ghost Story or whatever. And I like the shorter, more concise format. I like seeing what someone can do. There's no chance for it to jump the shark.
Sure.
It
No,
doesn't.
no one's going back to watch 5,000 episodes of NCIS or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's like I just want to see. I like seeing concise storytelling. I remember years ago, a friend of mine has had a good career as a producer and so forth, very respectable guy, but he was sort of complaining about movie shorthand, and I love movie shorthand. And I hate backstories. I hate backstories. Um, there should be a mystery. You should have to fill in a certain amount about characters, and I think people have forgotten mystery, the power of mystery in a story. Um, I don't have to, like, okay, the gang members in Peckinpah's Great Western, The Wild Bunch. I don't need to know everything about their past. I can sort of piece it together from what I'm being told. And I can sort of fill in the gaps for myself. I don't need to see a movie about their early life. All I want is the movie, this one movie, you know? Um, there's a lot of that in horror and science fiction and so forth. You know, I really don't need to see prequels or
Way too
yeah,
much of it. But speaking upon the Wild Bunch, I know there was supposed to be a remake from Mel Gibson and it fell through. Did you see Anton Fuqua's remake of The Magnificent Seven?
I skipped it. I skipped it. How was it?
I want you to watch it and I want to talk to you about it. I really
Okay.
and I mean it because I gave it a chance 3 years after it came out and it hit me as if I was like, "Wow, this is actually he really cared about this. He cared
Yeah.
about this
Yeah.
thing." I want to see if you feel the same.
Yeah, no, I mean, if someone has respect for the subject matter, of course, and The Magnificent Seven in and of itself was a kind of remake of Seven Samurai. So,
Yes.
so it seems logical. But I love the original. I love the original, and I love Seven Samurai so much. I didn't fool with it.
Give it a
I think
shot.
yeah.
I really want to hear what you think about it. I have a feeling
Okay.
you're going to appreciate it because I went in with low expectations and I was like, wow, like he really gave a shit about this.
You know, and sometimes, it's funny how things will hit you once they're kind of out of the limelight and you discover them on your own, you'll like them just on their own merits. When you don't have to deal with a PR blitz and you don't have to deal with people nattering on and on and on about it, and you just see it and watch it for its own merits, and it can win you over. That was how I mean, I love Friday. I absolutely love Friday. And when it first came out, I thought, "Oh, I don't want to watch this crap. Oh, it looks so lame." And I'd hear kids in school talking about it. I was like, "Ah, I don't want to see it. I don't see it." Years later, I caught it on TV and was just laughing my ass off. I just absolutely loved it. And I've seen it any number of times since. And I think John Witherspoon is just hysterically funny in it. And so sometimes things sneak up on you like that. We were talking about stuff, more recent stuff. I liked Dune and Dune Part Two.
Okay,
Um,
I did too. I like them very much, but what was it lacking? If you could be honest and say, I wish he would have done this or they would have allowed him to do this, what was it lacking?
he did a pretty good job overall. I thought a couple of the parts were kind of miscast, and I won't say who. Um, but other than that, I wish, for the sake of the many audience members who come to see it not having read the novel, I wish he had found a way to tell more about the backstory, because it's such a there's so much backstory. There is so much about why this society is the way it is, who these people are, how it all works. I wish he could have somehow worked that in for the benefit of the people who haven't read the book. Because I saw both part one and two, with a friend of mine who hadn't read the books, and I was sort of breaking down for her, what's not in there and why that's a mentat. There was what is it? There's the revolution with the android with AI.
Sure, and the guild
And
was missing too.
yeah, they barely have anything with the Spicers Guild. You don't see the guild navigators really. There's all kinds of stuff that's not in there, and characters vanish. Um, but overall, I thought they did a really good job. And I'll repeat what Harlan Ellison said about the David Lynch version. Just the fact that they even attempted or accomplished a good adaptation of Dune is extraordinary. As Ellison put it, it's a book that beggars the imagination. I mean, it's a gargantuan story with so many characters and so much going on. Just the fact that they could make a film like that, I thought they did a lot of things really, really well. Um, I saw part two in 70 millimeter at the Vista Theater here in LA with gorgeous sound, and when they had the subwoofers really going, and when Paul's riding the sandworm, you felt like you were on its back. It was extraordinary. I
It's
really
quite
enjoyed it.
promising that people came out in droves to see what I would say in terms of huge budget movie making, the antithesis of these silly superhero movies,
Yes, yes,
Dune.
yes. No, and there's also a sense of uh there's a sense of physics in the problem I've seen with so many superhero movies, and especially and this has been true of a lot of CGI, is there's no sense of physics, how physics works. And people are thrown 30 feet through the air, and there's all this stuff, and things are flying around, and this, that, and the other. And it's just kind of silly, and they don't allow things to register visually. And I was really impressed by the visual storytelling in Dune Part 2, particularly the battle sequences. There's the first scene where um, Paul and Chani and the Fremen are attacking a spice harvester. I love the fact the spice harvesters are designed; they look like ticks drinking the blood of the spice out of the sand of Arrakis. Um, but that sequence was really well shot and cut and exciting and suspenseful, and so many of the battle sequences in it were like that. And it was uh, it was just a very well made film on every level, and the effects, my God, I mean, I mean, the CG in it was just incredible. I mean, it was a very well made movie, very
Oh,
well made
yeah, it
movie.
certainly was. And I find myself going back to the first one. I think if I were to say, here's the thing. So in my imagination, I I think I made a better movie than what Jodorowsky may have made if he was able to make it. I keep imagining what this thing could have been or would have been, and it may be a better movie. What that includes are I just personally feel, and again, not for exploitation's sake, but in a motion picture of this magnitude, I think the final element needs to, especially when there's violence involved in many scenes, it should show it. And also anything else that would achieve a rated R or worse, it should have it. It should have,
I agree.
should
No, I
not hold
agree.
back.
No, I agree. And this is something uh I'm all for the use of sex and violence in stories if there's a sensibility behind it. There has to be a sensibility. I'll give you an example, like J.G. Ballard's fiction, of course, wrote High Rise and Crash and A Million Great Short Stories and Super Can and just amazing, amazing fiction. Empire of the Sun, just an astonishing writer, like one of the great writers of the last 50, 60 years. And his stories get very dark and very violent and very sexual and very kinky and all of these things, but there's this brilliant, brilliant mind behind them. It's the same with David Cronenberg. David Cronenberg is almost in a class by is I mean, I would say is in a class by himself in terms of he deals with subjects that are so over the top in terms of violence and sexuality and so forth, but there's such an extraordinary intelligence behind them.
Of course. And
And
that's
that
exactly what
makes
I'm
such a
talking
huge
about.
difference. Yeah,
Yeah, no, there
absolutely.
are
Or like
plenty of movies with violence, it
yeah, yeah, or like it's like Scorsese with Taxi Driver. I mean, it's all about who's doing it. There are so many people that just make kind of dumb, gory, grotesque movies, and they're just kind of repulsive or they're boring or whatever. But I agree with you, and I think there are certain stories that need to be told pretty graphically, and that holding back on them will, it sort of castrates the story.
Sure, and I'm sure somewhere in Denis Villeneuve's Dune outcuts there are much more violent scenes, but he needed to achieve this PG-13 rating. He had to.
Yeah, and I thought they handled it well. And it was pretty. The violent scenes were handled pretty well. Of course, in the book, it gets so graphic. I mean, with like Baron Harkonnen's sex depraved sexual predilections and stuff, and and also with the what do you call them, the Harkonnens and just their incredibly horrible world. They sort of they get at that. They
Sure.
sort of the way that they murder their handmaidens and so forth in the movie. They sort of get at it, but
Yeah, there wasn't much
um,
of that in John Harrison's Dune, even though I don't hate that movie.
no, no, he did a good job. I mean, I think he's very, very talented. Of course, he was working on a lower budget and so forth, but he used such good people in it, like William Hurt and Giancarlo Giannini and all that. It was very good. And I actually like a lot of things about the Lynch version. I think particularly in terms of the cast and the art direction and the costumes
Oh,
and so
yeah.
forth.
No, I'm one of the few that
Um,
love it.
yeah, no, I like it. It's they I think the cast is absolutely phenomenal in the Lynch version. I mean, the only thing I'm sad about is, Gurney Halleck was originally gonna be played by Aldo Ray, and who, of course, was a highly decorated World War II vet and was just a hard, tough looking guy. And they'd created a still suit for him that would act kind of like a cummerbund to sort of he'd gotten a bit of a gut from drinking it and it sort of held it in. I've seen pictures of it. And he was on the film and, he was, like, drunk and disorderly and got in fights and all this other stuff, so they replaced him with Patrick Stewart, and Patrick Stewart's fine in it, but it's not really the character Gurney Halleck as written. I thought, Josh Brolin did a really, really good job in the new one. He had such he's really become a fine actor, and he reminds me so much of his dad. And he had such a good sense of humor. He brought so much humor to the movie. But
If
but
okay,
yeah,
and I wanna ask you this again, imagining if Jodorowsky's version was made, do you think it would have changed everything as people suspected, if it was
no,
actually accomplished?
no, no, I don't think so. I think it probably would have stayed at kind of the level of his other movies in terms of broad popularity. I think it would have been like El Topo, like El Topo, like Holy Mountain. I think it would have a following, but it's something that would a lot of people just wouldn't know what to make of. And
Sure, it would have been another midnight movie, right?
we got another midnight movie, yeah, because I think it was so different from what Frank Herbert intended. His ideas were so wildly different. The funniest thing though is how the artistic team from that got cherry picked for Alien. It was what was it? Mobius, I think Chris Foss,
Right.
Mobius, Chris
O'Bannon,
Foss,
Dan
yeah,
O'Bannon?
O'Bannon, Giger, and who was the other one? I think there's one other artist, and they all got brought on to Alien, and which of course is like that's sort of what Lucas did with Silent Running. George Lucas took so many people from the effects team and quite a few ideas from Silent Running and carried them over into Star Wars. And so it happens. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Um, but no, I don't know if people. I mean, I think what Jodorowsky was trying to do was so far out. I don't know if people would have known quite what to do with it. But the especially in the wake of Star Wars,
Sure.
where
Yeah, you're putting it in context of the times because if we were talking earlier about Blade Runner and we were talking about The Thing, and they were brilliant films and they didn't change the world and they were appreciated later, so much like Sorcerer or the others that I just talked about, Jodorowsky's Dune probably would have been appreciated later.
yeah, no, I think so. Like I'll give you another perfect example of that is Phantom of the Paradise. It's one of my all-time favorites, and when Phantom came out, it bombed, and it did not deserve to bomb. There's a lot of, I mean, it's a whole other conversation about why, but over time, some people got it immediately, and in certain places it did really well. In Winnipeg, it did really well. In Paris, it did really well. And but only over time did more and more people start to discover it and and realize what an amazing film it is. It was just too different for audiences of the time. I think that's true of Night of the Hunter. That's another one like that. Fantasia is another like that. Um, may probably even Free. I mentioned Freaks and Peeping Tom earlier. These are films that are so different and in some ways so intense that it takes a while for people to catch up with them. They're 20 years ahead of the time, so it takes 20 years for people to really grasp them.
Are there any
But
films like that today that you believe? I mean, it's hard to say, but
I think they come along periodically. One that took a while for people to catch on to, that I think is just a masterpiece, is Mike Judge's Idiocracy.
sure, it took a while for people to now that has its own cult.
Oh yeah, because I think what happened was it's a movie about it's a terrifying satire. It's a terrifying film on certain levels because when I remember when it came out, I heard about it slightly after it came out. And so many people I knew were saying, "Oh my god, this is exactly what I think of the world around me. This is our society. It is being so dumbed down and so degraded and becoming so barbaric, and no one's doing anything about it. It's just the bar is getting lower and lower and lower and lower." And it was like all of a sudden we were all like, "Oh my god, somebody else noticed and is speaking completely openly about it and hilariously." But I think a lot of audience members, honestly, were so stupid, they didn't realize it was about them. If you are showing it to an audience of idiots, they're not gonna grasp it. They're too stupid to realize, "Hey, wait a second. Good God, that's me. He's making fun of me. Jesus, maybe I need to get my shit together and actually read a book every now and then," you know? But it's there's that what is it? There's something they call the Dunning-Kruger effect, where someone is so stupid, they're so lacking in self-reflection that they can't even stop and say, "Wait, I'm really ignorant. I need to learn something." They're in this Mobius strip of stupidity where they're so stupid they will never work out their own stupidity.
My
And
sentiments exactly. But see, your disdain for stuff like that could drag you into a similar place, or not exactly the same. But the idea is, what can you offer before we get to the last part of this? What could you possibly offer people now that have everything in their hands? Education is free, equipment is at their access, but art is from within. We never needed all of this tech to create good movies. Ultimately, all of these movies that we're discussing here, the ones that blew us away or later you appreciated, were made with something within. And what would you say to anyone who's listening that has the urge or is even making movies or has the ability to do it, and they waste their time, much like an idiocracy, spouting off on YouTube? Or, and no offense to anybody on YouTube, but
yeah,
I'm
sure.
just saying, like, you have all of this tech, but you make TikTok videos with it. And you can make art that speaks to the world. It can create a whole new movement.
Yeah, and it's all about who does it. That's it. That's it. I would I don't know. I think um I don't quite know how to answer that, but I'll say I'll put this in kind of a roundabout way. I just saw a wonderful documentary last night called Clay Dream, and it was about Will Vinton, who was behind Claymation and the California Raisins, and I mean some really extraordinary stop motion films, The Adventures of Mark Twain, and so forth. And what you see in guys like him and the people that really push these mediums is this love and affection for creativity and imagination. And I think what's lacking, I think there are some very creative people on YouTube. There's some very creative people. I don't know about TikTok. I can't speak for it. I don't like the idea. It's kind of like Twitter, it's too reductive. I think the danger in a lot of these things is the reductiveness, trying to make everything too fast. You can't, I mean, I don't think it's a good idea. But uh, there's, it's in general, it's so much of it is based on narcissism. That's the real danger. It's people who are saying, "Look at me, I'm a star. I'm out buying coffee. I'm in Cartagena. Look at my fancy clothes." There's this sort of dull egotism and narcissism to it. And I think some of the best stuff that's been coming out of there is just comedy. I mean, there are some really hilarious people on social media that aren't getting a break into, TV and movies and so forth. And they don't have to go through censors or a board of directors or anything. They can just go and do whatever crazy stuff they want. But I think I think imagination is respected, but not like it used to be somehow. Or I don't know if people are being encouraged to be really imaginative. And I don't know if audiences really I think they have a harder time grasping it when they see something really imaginative. And I think they've always kind of had problems with that. I think this is something that has gone on for generations where, I mean, I have no I'm not even going to try and say how far back it goes to, but um a lot of adults let their imaginative faculties wither and die. They let them atrophy, they let them wither and die, and they lose that sort of childlike sense of wonder, that sort of magical thinking. But on the other hand, some adults, like a lot of the creative people I know, build and expand and continue strengthening their imagination the way a bodybuilder expands his delts and his pecs and his lats, and they grow and strengthen their imaginations and continue, and they do really amazing stuff with it. They never lose that joy and love of creativity. And I think the narcissism is the big thing that's tainting a lot of social media. That it's more about that, this is why you have kids now who don't really want to be movie stars, they want to be influencers.
Right.
And
I
and
do
honestly,
believe that will change. And and
I think it will.
and
I
again,
think
it
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 will.
doesn't movie making doesn't lend to TikTok and YouTube, really. I mean, YouTube
No, those are like
definitely
it's
because
like a gag.
right,
It's
because
like
you
you have
can't
time for one gag.
there are
I
too many
mean,
rules on YouTube. There are algorithmic rules that don't apply to the maverick filmmaker at all. And also it takes time to make a motion picture, especially independently. You could take years. It could take years to make a movie. Look at Eraserhead, even back then.
yeah, yeah, or I mean, how people wind up doing, yeah, they do them on weekends and it takes them ages. And that's or John Carpenter with Dark Star. There was something, this is something you hear a lot of filmmakers say over the years is if a movie is absolute hell to make, if you think you're going to die, if you think everything's going to fall apart, if everything's constantly breaking, if there's mosquitoes everywhere, if there's a biblical plague visited on the set or something, the movie winds up turning out really well. For like it's for some reason that works. That film turns out really well, partly because there's a kind of I guess a desperate need to make it good and finish it. A deep commitment. But then a movie that's like there's no problems on the set and everything went perfectly just turns out kind of bland. And that's not true across the board by any means, but a lot of really great films, and really enormously popular, enormously successful films had hellish productions. I mean, absolutely hellish. I mean, the obvious one right off the bat would be like Jaws. Um, but yeah. So
Well, I like to remain optimistic. I don't know. I instinctively feel we're on the precipice of something that might really, in the next portion of our life, in the next chapters of, and I'm talking specifically you and I and people like us, that we're going to be very happy. I think with cinema.
I know I agree. I think it's mutating now. It's in a period of change, and but it's a young medium. It is a very young art form. It is a very young medium. Um, it has George Pal's son David told me years ago. He said we haven't had a Mozart of the cinema. We haven't had a Beethoven of the cinema. There are probably great filmmakers, really, really great and brilliant filmmakers who haven't been born yet. Um, it's funny. I say this because I remember I saw Taxi Driver in 2016. I'd seen it many, many times on video and a few times on film, but I went to see it in its 40th anniversary. And I remember sitting there watching it and going, "Oh my God, this movie looks like I've seen it so many times, but just seeing it again fresh, I thought this movie looks like it was made 50 years in the future by a more sophisticated race. Like it was made by some advanced alien world that's, making movies hundreds of years ahead of what we're doing. There's just something about it that has this incredible grasp of the cinematic form. And so I say it movies have a long way to go. They're not that old, and I think we're still experiencing their I won't say their birth pains, but their development, you know.
Though that
And
gives me great optimism to think about it that way. It does.
yeah, I think we should, because there's so many places it can go. There's so many places they can go, and there's so many things that we haven't seen yet, and of course with the technology getting better, I think it's all about, again, it goes back to whose hands it's in. Who's making the movies? Who can take that technology and turn it into something really, really magnificent? So that remains to be seen.
Amen. I really appreciate this, Justin, and I'd love to have you back again for another discussion down the road. I ask everybody this on the way out, and there's no right or wrong answer. So when it's time for you to leave this physical existence, if you believe you go on somewhere or you don't, what would you take with you?
In terms of just anything,
It could be anything. Your answer is your answer.
anything. Okay, all right. My immediate answer would be, it's a book called A Treasury of the Familiar. And my grandfather had a copy. I inherited his copy, and I have a separate copy that I read. Treasury of the Familiar was a collection. It's widely available. It's a very common book. Um, it's from, I think, the 20s or 30s, and it's basically a collection of great poems, great songs, great speeches, great passages from Shakespeare. All of these things that are a cultural cornerstone, that are a fundament of our culture as of that time. And it was effectively, if you couldn't afford to go to college, if you read A Treasury of the Familiar several times, you would effectively come away with probably something like a decent college education. And it's just such a great book. I can always go back to it. It's a reminder of things that really matter and have lasting value. And I think I would take that with me. I think that would be a good use of space in the next dimension.
Welcome back to Off to the Witch. I'm your host, Christopher Garatano, and I want to thank you for joining the conversation tonight. Movies are my world. Much like many of you, they spoke to me when I was a child. It was always the greatest escape and the most wonderful inspiration. What I ultimately received wrote the details of my pathway forever. I'm optimistic for the future of cinema, and I look forward to contributing to this beautiful history. Step away from the toxicity and conflict of the internet, and instead dive into a good book or a great movie. Until next time.